Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. That feels so weird to say, but here we are. So I have been battling with this case in my mind for so many years, to tell you the truth. I actually used to live in the town that this case happened in, so honestly I feel a little bit closer to this case in particular. But this case is wild, so bear with me. This case actually inspired an award-winning movie called 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. There are some differences and such, but it stays pretty true to what actually happened here in Texas in 1991. This case has also been featured on Unsolved Mysteries and Cold Justice on Oxygen. This case and the investigation are so infuriating, and there's just going to be so many parts where you're just like, what the heck is going on? So grab a seat, grab a coffee, hold on to your butts, and let's get into it. I'm going to tell you about the case of Kathi Page. Lucille Catherine Fulton was born in Vidor, Texas to her parents, Dorothy and James Fulton, on January 8th, 1957. She had 3 sisters, Jan, Sherry, and Diane. There's really not a lot of information that I could find about her childhood, but on her daughter's blog, her daughter does go on to say that she had a pretty tumultuous childhood. She started couch surfing at the age of 14. So she wasn't really super close with her family and her parents. Her family did describe her though as a lot of fun, and with her striking features, it really made her popular with the male population in Vidor, which I've lived in Vidor and it's not that impressive. When she was 21 years old, she was working at a waitress when she met a local boy named Steve Page. He was 22. He worked as an insurance salesman and he really loved basketball, which her family would actually come to use this against him later on down the road. However, when they met, Steve was actually married to a woman named Anita Duhan. Steve had swept Kathi off of her feet, and from the beginning, he pretty much had majority of her family's approval. However, Kathi's older sister Sherry claims that he was arrogant and she really didn't see him as Kathi's type. Steve and Anita got divorced on August 8th, 1978, and just 3 months later on November 18th, him and Kathi were married. Shortly thereafter, they welcomed their first daughter, Erin, in May of 1979. So that means that she was pregnant when they got married, and that the infidelity on Steve's part is more than likely what led to Anita and Steve's divorce. But I digress. By most accounts, Steve and Kathi seem to have a pretty happy marriage for a really long time, even welcoming a second daughter, Monica, in 1983. They were a super close family who lived in a small town and pretty close to their extended family as well. They were what you would envision a small town family to be. Unfortunately, that did not last long. And by early May of 1991, things had gone south in the marriage. Kathi took a waitressing job at a restaurant in a town about 15 minutes from Vidor called Beaumont. This is actually my hometown. She made friends working this job, extending her social life, and she even started taking classes at a local college. It was clear that she was drifting apart from her 13-year marriage with Steve. She was trying to be her own person, trying to find who she was, and just trying to grow into the person that she felt like she was supposed to be. So in early May of 1991, Kathi had actually asked Steve for a separation. He agreed, and he moved his things into an apartment across the highway from their house. They remained friendly and civil for the sake of their daughters. The family even spent Mother's Day together at the beach that year. That was May 12th. The next day, May 13th, Steve went to the family home and helped the girls get ready for the day before taking them to school. According to Steve, later on that day, he helped Kathi wash her car before they drove separately to the girls' softball games. They were seen at the ballpark together, and when Monica's game ended, Kathi took her home and Steve waited for Erin's game to be over with before bringing her home as well. Allegedly, he left the home around 10:30 p.m., only to be called back by Kathi around 11. You see, she wanted to go out for some drinks with some friends and she wanted him to babysit. This can be corroborated by some of her friends and family who Kathi had also called to try to get them to watch the girls, but none of them were able to. So that's when she called Steve. According to Steve, she left the home around 11:15 or 11:30 to head to Beaumont to meet her friend. However, her friend Charlotte Morgan said that Kathi called her around 9:30 or 10, but she didn't ask if she could watch the girls. Instead, she asked if she could cover for her with Steve. You see, Kathi had a boyfriend in Beaumont and was going to go meet him at a motel. Charlotte had covered for Kathi in the past, so when she asked her, it wasn't out of the ordinary. But instead of just covering for her, Kathi asked her if she could just not pick up the phone in case Steve called, which he did. Charlotte received a phone call around 2:30 a.m. and when she answered, the caller hung up. Charlotte shrugged it off, assumed it was Steve, and just fell back asleep. So let's fast forward to 4:15 a.m. Between 4:15 and 4:30 a.m., a newspaper boy was beginning his route for the day when he stumbled across a black Mercury tracer that had appeared to be wrecked in a relatively shallow ditch only 100 yards from Kathi Page's home. When police officers arrived, they found 34-year-old Kathi Page in the driver's seat, and unfortunately, she was no longer alive. Investigators immediately realized that her death was no accident. She had no obvious wounds or injuries that would have been consistent with a car crash. The car was barely damaged. She had a drink in the cup holder that hadn't even been spilled. And probably the most critical thing of all was that her body was found in the driver's seat. Her feet were pushed back against the seat instead of stretched towards the pedals, and despite her not wearing a seatbelt, her body remained in a reclined position in her seat rather than being lunged forward like you would see in a car accident. When police arrived at Kathy's home, Steve answered the door in his boxers as if he had just woken up. When told about his wife's death, investigators note how odd Steve's reaction was. He sounded like he was crying. He even threw himself on the couch a time or two. But then he would gain his composure and act like he was completely fine. An officer states that upon shining a flashlight in Steve's face, you can see that there were no tears. Now, we all know we can't say how someone can and can't grieve, but I feel like if you're putting on these hysterics, acting like you're upset, maybe try to force a tear or two. Since that morning, Steve has been considered the prime suspect of the murder of Kathi Page. When asked, Steve declined the execution of an autopsy on Kathi. Kathy's father later went behind him and actually gave them the consent necessary. Upon further investigation, it's noted that Kathi was not wearing any makeup or any jewelry when she was found, which that is definitely not the way that she went out. Her autopsy showed that she had been beaten and strangled by someone who was more than likely left-handed. So remember earlier whenever I said that Steve played basketball? His family claims that because of his skill in basketball, he was ambidextrous, which means he was able to use his left and right hands to do pretty much anything. So my camera decided to cut me off for whatever reason. So in her autopsy, it was also shown that she had blood in her underwear and on her skin, but none on her clothing, as if she had been cleaned up and redressed before being placed in the car. So just keep that in mind. The autopsy also shows that Kathi had sex shortly before her death. Yikes. This is when authorities learned that night she had actually spent the night with her boyfriend in a motel room in Beaumont. Her boyfriend acknowledged that they had sex that night, offered to take a polygraph test, and passed with flying colors. He's never been a suspect. The autopsy report also showed that whoever Kathi had sex with that night had a vasectomy because the sperm was not viable. The boyfriend had not had a vasectomy, so that means that Kathi had sex with somebody else before her death. Authorities discovered that Steve had actually had a vasectomy a few months prior. So, big yikes. When questioned, Steve admitted that they had sex, but claimed that it was consensual and that it was before she left for that evening. Kathy's sister Sherry does not think that that's true at all. She strongly believes that Kathi would not have had consensual sex with Steve before going to do so with her boyfriend. She also claims that Steve was already sleeping on the couch prior to him moving out, so there was really no chemistry or intimacy between them. Sherry found out from Steve's sister-in-law that Steve had actually made 2 phone calls to 2 different phone numbers the night of Kathy's death. Apparently, Kathi wrote these 2 phone numbers down and Steve called them to see who they were. This number belonged to Charlotte, which we know that at 2:30 a.m. Steve had called Charlotte and woke her up and then just hung up. But the other phone number was the motel. Sherry and Kathy's father, James, believe that Steve found these phone numbers and became furious when he realized that Kathi had actually lied to him about what she was doing that evening. It's speculated that when Kathi came home during the early hours of May 14th, that she took a shower, got ready for bed, and was then confronted by Steve, who then proceeded to attack, assault, and strangle her. When he realized what he'd done, he felt remorseful, so he cleaned her up, redressed her, placed her in the car before rolling it into the drainage ditch. Keep in mind, it's only 100 yards from their home. Steve, of course, denies that he has any involvement with her murder. Steve claims that a member of a prominent Italian family in Beaumont, known as the Beaumont Mafia, was responsible for her death and was trying to frame him. I lived in Beaumont for 16 plus years, and even doing some research on it, and I was not able to find anything about the Beaumont Mafia. So nice try, Steve, because it doesn't exist. So let's get into how the Vidor Police Department and the Orange District Attorney's Office completely botched this case. If this doesn't infuriate you, then I don't know what to tell you because this is just incompetence on a whole other level. So let's start with the fact that the crime scene photos that were taken of Kathi were taken on a camera that did not have any film. They did not put film in the camera before taking pictures of the crime scene. Upon finding Steve suspicious, he was still not questioned, the home was not cleared, and the home was not searched. The Page home should have automatically been considered a crime scene because that morning they still hadn't learned where Kathi was the night prior, much less where she had been killed. What they did know was that the scene was staged, and any seasoned or logical investigator would have immediately searched the home of the murder victim, even if they knew that that was not where the crime took place. Detective Ray Mosley found Steve to be highly suspicious. Yet, for some reason, they decided not to secure the home while they waited on a search warrant. In fact, it took them 3 years to convince the district attorney's office to issue a search warrant for the Page home. And by that time, Steve was already moved out. Steve proceeded to call Kathy's parents and let them know what happened. When they arrived, Dorothy, Kathy's mother, noticed a scratch on Steve's nose. This scratch was later denied by Steve, his family, and the police. And here's another problem. We would be able to know for sure, but the police didn't take any pictures of Steve. There were no photographs taken of his hands, his face, anything to put on record as to whether or not he had a scratch or he didn't. Again, Steve was considered the prime suspect immediately. Even if he had no scratches, taking photographs of his appearance would have been checking off of a list that even Vidor Police Department should have been aware of. But there were no lists, nothing done properly. This was just really bad police work. Everything the police did that morning seemed suspicious to a lot of people, but especially James Fulton, Kathy's father. But to me, they just seemed like careless, incompetent mistakes. Perhaps by cops who had no idea what they were doing or any idea what they were getting themselves into as far as a murder case goes. To make matters worse, the Vidor Police Department declined any outside help from anyone, really. They got offers from the Texas Rangers and even the FBI, and they turned down all help. Steve would go on to tell Kathy's mom that he hoped that they didn't search his home, because that they would definitely find blood on the carpet from where Kathi was shaving her legs in the living room. Okay, I don't know about any of you, but I have never, ever shaved my legs in the living room. Ever. But okay. Kathy's father can also be a witness to that, as he heard Steve tell Dorothy this. And James actually tried to convince Steve to let the police search their home because guess what? The police tried, but they were denied. I gotta give the police a little, I guess, prop on that one because they actually tried, and without a warrant, they really couldn't do anything. They just kind of said, hey, can we do this without a warrant? And Steve said, no. He was pretty much making their jobs harder by having to go get a warrant that they took 3 years to get. So now we know the police at least asked to come in, but were denied. A whole day went by before Steve went in for questioning. Detective Mosley interviewed Steve at the police station that Tuesday afternoon. Steve told him that he didn't want them to search his home because they might find something that would incriminate him. Well, would you look at that? It was then that he told the detective that he and Kathi had consensual sex before he left that evening. He claimed that when he arrived that evening to watch the girls, that Kathi was wrapped in a towel and he approached her to have sex, and then they had sex on the floor in the living room, right where he told Kathy's mother that there was blood from her shaving her legs. How convenient. Detective Mosley claims that at this point in the interview, he looks over at Steve and doesn't see any kind of scratches or any kind of marks on his hands or his face. He also said this years later at the civil trials, but there's no photograph. Detective Mosley has contradicted himself many times. He absolutely paints Steve in a suspicious light, but insists that they have no evidence because they didn't look for it. By Wednesday, Sherry went to go visit Steve and her nieces, and when Steve opened the door, she noticed a really strong smell. Steve said that he had spilled some grease, so they were deep cleaning the carpet. Sherry noticed some oscillating fans that were pointed toward the carpet, which Steve said that was to dry it out. 2 store clerks would later testify that earlier that day, Steve and 2 other people, presumably his sisters, came and rented a carpet cleaner. The next day was Kathy's viewing. Her family noted strange behavior coming from Steve. He was crying without any tears, acting super distraught without actually crying, And he kept referring to Kathy's body as it, not Kathi or my wife or, you know, the mother of my children. No, she was it. Same thing the next day at her funeral, but of course his family says otherwise. That Saturday, Dorothy arrived to see her grandchildren, and she said that Steve was burning something in the backyard, but she wasn't sure what it was. She asked, but he never really gave her a straight answer. The next day, when James arrived, he claims that Steve's mom, sisters, and sisters-in-law were all working on cleaning the carpet. Steve's mom told him that Steve had spilled some grease on the carpet, but James didn't believe him. And in that moment, he claims that he knew that Steve was responsible for Kathy's murder. In 1993, James Fulton put up 3 billboards on his property in Vidor. One that says, "Vidor police botched up the case, waiting for confession, and this could happen to you." He's put up multiple other billboards since and has stated that they will stay up until he dies. He believes the police department took a bribe and were just trying to cover for Steve, since apparently Steve's parents knew and were friends with the police chief at the time. In 1999, Steve was found financially liable for Kathy's death in civil court. He was ordered to pay $200,000 to her family. He has yet to be charged criminally with her murder, and honestly, I don't think it's gonna happen. Eventually, Kathy's family became aware of somebody desecrating her grave, knocking her flowers over, breaking them, stuff like that. So they decided to put a security camera up to see who it was, and it was Steve. It was Steve desecrating his dead wife's grave. He was eventually convicted of this, and when asked, he said he did it because he was angry with her family and their treatment of him. How you can desecrate someone's grave, like the mother of your children's grave, and not be the one who killed her. I don't get that. So Steve is still living in Texas, and the true heartbreak of this case is what happened to Kathi and Steve's daughters. Steve moved Aaron and Monica to live with his family in Tennessee almost 3 years after the death of their mother, and then the girls were already estranged from Kathy's family. Aaron wrote a blog in the following years where she speaks of grief and blame. She goes to say, and I quote, "When a child loses their parent, they don't want to hear anything negative about the other parent," end quote. Which I totally get, but I also get that the Fultons were probably just trying to get the girls to understand what their father had done, or what they think he had done, rather. The girls eventually found out that the Fultons wanted custody of them, and they were pretty against this, considering they were persistent in bad-mouthing Steve and obsessing over the death of Kathi when they just wanted to move on. They were just kids when their mom passed away, and they just wanted to have normal lives at some point. I feel it's possible that the girls couldn't process the same rage that Kathy's family felt just because they were so young and they were just going through so much. I don't think that they were able to fully process what was happening. Aaron says that Steve's family was the one to take care of her and Monica. He brought her to his sisters and just kind of bounced. Aaron has stated that she doesn't speak to her father or the Fultons to this day, and she doesn't call James and Dorothy grandmother and grandfather, or grandma, grandpa. She says Mr. and Mrs. Fulton in her blog. So I really think that that goes to show how hurt she was by everything that was happening. Monica, Kathy's youngest daughter, actually passed away in 2011 at the age of 28 years old from a drug overdose. Yeah, I don't really think there's much to say on that. To me, I feel like that just goes to show the kind of pain that she was harboring for years. But yeah, so I hope that she is resting in peace with Kathi. Erin has gone to say that she hates the billboards. She said, "To me, this billboard is not about my mother. It's about two stubborn and selfish men with too much guilt to carry." She feels as if the billboard comes from a place of revenge instead of justice for her mother. In 2018, Kathy's case was actually profiled on Cold Justice, and dozens of witnesses were interviewed for it. They also found a new witness who reported seeing Steve walk away from the ditch where Kathy's car was found the night of her murder, but he never came forward because he was with a mistress that night. Steve continues to claim his innocence and denies that he had any involvement in Kathy's murder. The Vidor police say that they have never been able to rightfully convict Steve because they just don't have enough plausible evidence. I mean, he's just living free, and you know, it's a really tough case because you really feel like there hasn't been any justice for Kathi, because they have all of this evidence that they don't deem plausible, but realistically it kind of is.
Kathy's father hopes that the movie that came out in 2017, I believe it was, brings new interest to Kathy's case, but new interest does not mean new evidence.
So as far as theories go, what do you think happened? Do you think Steve had something to do with it, or do you think that the Beaumont Mafia killed Kathi for whatever reason? Let me know down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, because I plan on doing a lot more of these, and I promise I will get better at it. This is my first one, so if you've made it this far, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye, guys.